A while back when we were looking at the program selections for today, I felt there was a need to get an update on our neighbor across this pond, and that's China. So I went through my Rolodex and called up Admiral Bill Center and said, Bill, what can you do for us? And as in his usual fashion, he found someone I think is incredibly qualified to give us an update. So Admiral Bill Center, could you please introduce our main program, please?
Thank you, President Paul. Teresa, when he gave you that card, he didn't give you the usual speech of, you should, in addition to an attorney, you should always have a hotelier as well in your Rolodex. Fellow Rotarians, it's my honor and privilege to introduce my friend Joe Borich, President of the Washington State China Relations Council. Joe has a well-earned reputation around these parts as one of the go-to guys for questions about doing business in China. I particularly trust and value his opinion, not only because of his expertise, experience, and candor, but because he's one of those very rare experts who's unafraid to occasionally answer a question with the words, I don't know. Joe served in the Army in Vietnam, then he spent a distinguished 25-year career in the Foreign Service, where he would likely say his most harrowing adventure was being airlifted out of Mogadishu by the United States Marine Corps. Yeah, the Navy provided a landing place anyway. Of most interest to us today, however, is his final posting. From 1990 to 1997, he was the U.S. Consul General in Shanghai. He's going to talk to us today. He's going to answer the question, is this the transition from the American century to the century of China? And I'm pretty sure this isn't going to be one of those questions where he says, I don't know. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Joe Borich.
Au contraire, I don't know. First of all, I truly feel that I'm honored and very privileged to be standing here addressing you today. I can't imagine a greater honor than to stand before the world's largest Rotary and speak about a subject that I dearly love. Also, I'd note that my connection to Rotary goes back to Shanghai. As I'm sure you're all aware, Seattle 4 Rotary founded the Shanghai Rotary, I don't know how many decades ago. It kind of disappeared for a while, starting around 1949, but by the mid-90s it was back again. So I feel a very strong connection with this Rotary in particular for that reason. I'd also like to thank Admiral Center and President Paul and Sue Nixon for arranging for me to be here today. Well, are we, in fact, in transition from the American century to the China century? I think you'd have to say that the 21st century has certainly started out as though it's going to be China's century, and over the past 25 years, and in particular this past decade, China has invested literally trillions of dollars in roads, rails, ports, airports, the power grid, and telecommunications. If you take China's rail network as an example, Beijing is now in the midst of a $300 billion expansion of its rail network, including more than 8,000 miles of new tracks specifically designed for its high-speed bullet trains capable of traveling 250 miles an hour. I took that, by the way, in March last year from Beijing to Shanghai. And it was not traveling at top speed, but we still made the trip in about 4.5 hours. For expressways, China now has the second largest expressway network in the world. Work on it continues apace, and before long, China will certainly surpass the United States in terms of the total miles of high-speed roads. For air travel, there are now currently more than 40 airports under construction. In telecommunications, all of China's cities are now linked by backbone fiber optic cable. There are more than 700 million people connected to the internet, and there are 1 billion smartphones in use in China. You can find similar examples of the phenomenal growth of China's infrastructure spread throughout the country and across all sectors. All of this infrastructure investment for transportation and communications is having the cumulative effect of diminishing time and space within China and between China and the rest of the world. And I believe it is this newfound world-class ability to connect people and businesses across time and space that, as much as anything, underlies China's competitive advantage today and will certainly continue to do so in the future. Along with infrastructure, China is also investing massively in education. It now can boast more college graduates each year than the United States. There are more than 700,000 graduating with engineering certificates or degrees. I think the above illustration helps to show, or the above examples help to illustrate how China is making a leap from the 19th century to the vanguard of the 21st century. And this transformation is barely a quarter century's time is not only unprecedented in China's history, I would argue there are no precedents in global history. So what is all this leading to? China's oft-stated goal is to become a mid-level developed country by the end of this century. That sounds like a modest goal, given all that China has done so far, and in particular, if you measure it against China's frequently glorious past. 600 years ago, Chinese Navy ruled the seas unchallenged. It was the global center for education, science and technology, governance, arts, and accounted for about 50% of global GDP. Even after China's long decline had started on the right up to the first of the Opium Wars, it still accounted for nearly a third of global GDP. So I guess the question is, can China reclaim its historic glory? Possibly. But there are still major changes that China must grapple with. Two of these are longer term. And when I say longer term, I don't mean that China can postpone dealing with them. It means that even if they started now and they're trying to find effective measures for them, it's going to be decades before positive impact can be made. The first of these is energy. Beijing must find effective answers to the need for more and cleaner energy and to address its environmental problems. China is already the world leader in energy consumption and also in greenhouse gas generation. Heavy industry is the big power consumer in China. Roughly 70% of China's generating power goes to heavy industry. To meet growing demand, China is adding each week power generation capacity at a rate that's equal to the amount of energy used to power the city of Seattle. But it's not just about power generation and heavy industry. China now is also the world's leading market for automobile sales and the world's leading manufacturer of automobiles. And its market share of global sales is going to continue to increase for quite some time. Project ahead a decade or two when private car ownership rises from the current rate of about 10% of the population to somewhere between 30 and 40%. And barring economic catastrophe, this is almost certainly going to happen. What will the impact of another 400 to 500 million cars on China's roads have on its own environment as well as the biosphere generally? The second longer-term issue that China must come up with answers for is demographics. China's population is getting older. One demographic consequence of the one-child policy is that China is now one of the most rapidly aging countries in the world. Currently, there are about 167 million people in China over the age of 60. That number will grow to 248 million by 2020 and to 437 million by mid-century. If birth rates do not change dramatically before then, about one-third of China's population will be over the age of 60 by mid-century, and China's population pyramid will look like a top-heavy hourglass. The challenge for China then in this regard is, can it get rich before it gets old? There are also a couple of more pressing challenges which I'd like to explore briefly. One is rebalancing China's economy, and the other is corruption. And I think to address these two issues successfully, China is going to have to fold them into sweeping reform. 10 years ago, when China's new leadership headed by Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, was unveiled, there was widespread expectation that a period of significant political reform was about to unfold. This was, after all, the first time in China's long history that an institutionalized process was created and effectively implemented to turn over power in an orderly fashion. Apparently, China and its leadership did not see things the same way. What we got instead was harmonious society. Now, harmonious society, which has been sort of the operating policy for the leadership group that had just retired, aimed at bringing relief to China's underpaid peasants and least paid urban workers, as well as to the 50 million or so workers who lost their jobs in the shakeout of the state-owned enterprise system in the late 1990s. Some progress was made on the goals of harmonious society. Peasant incomes did go up. More resources were allocated toward rebuilding a social security system, as well as to healthcare, education assistance, and low-income housing. But the past 10 years have also been marked by the rise of powerful interest groups, among them leaders of the revamped state-owned enterprise system, the People's Liberation Army, and entrenched provincial and municipal governments as well. These interest groups today are represented at or near the top by factional leaders who have become highly resistant to meaningful reform of any kind that does not advance their interests. Along with the rise of powerful interest groups has come pervasive corruption, now infecting all levels of China's society and government. Entrenched interests and corruption created a decade of growing income inequality and resentment among the have-nots, especially because the income inequality is widely viewed as resulting in large measure from corruption. Resentment increasingly is boiling over into acts of protest. Though no figures have been released for 2011 or 2012, China's government did acknowledge that there were 180,000 acts of protest in 2010. That's nearly 500 a day. Adding to the problem is China's slowing economy, having fallen from double-digit growth past years to about 7.8% in 2012. Slowing growth was probably inevitable for China, due in part to the fact that the principal drivers of growth, fixed asset investment in factories and infrastructure, exports, and increasingly of late urbanization, cannot sustain indefinitely such high levels of growth as China has experienced. The first two drivers, fixed asset investment and exports, are running out of gas, if I may say it that way. And the third, urbanization, while I think still holding great potential, is nonetheless plagued with structural problems, at least for now. I don't want to imply that China is now saturated with factories and infrastructure, but the pace of both over the past decade may be close to outstripping current need. Industrial consolidation is arguably what China now needs, not more automobile factories and steel plants. And while there are still large areas of China that are relatively untouched by modern highways and rail links, the rush to build such things over the past decade has included many highly questionable investments in bridges to nowhere and cities without inhabitants. Similarly, China's high dependence on exports for growth is not sustainable. In the near term, Europe's continuing financial distress and major uncertainties lingering on in the U.S. economy render prospects for significant growth in China's export sector highly problematic. Longer term, China's reliance on exports for growth and its determination to maintain a positive balance of trade while continuing to grow foreign exchange reserves have appeared to other governments as latter-day mercantilism, and there is a continuing threat of retaliatory measures by the U.S. and the EU. And I would note in passing that the House legislation was introduced in the House of Representatives today to impose sanctions on China for currency manipulation. China must also contend with rising labor and other input costs of production and the growing competitiveness of other developing economies. For the past several years, the Chinese government, aware of the fast approaching limits on growth presented by its traditional economic drivers, has been seeking to rebalance its economy by putting more emphasis on the domestic market and less on investments and exports. And along with and presumably supporting this rebalancing is a growing faith in China that urbanization will drive consumerism and economic growth. While urbanization and expanding consumerism may well be the way out of China's economic conundrum, getting there will not be an easy matter. Expanding China's domestic consumer market, for example, must be coupled with other structural adjustments to boost consumer confidence, including far greater social spending. In the old days of the top-down command economy, China didn't have very much, but what it had was relatively equitably distributed. In today's capitalist China, the various social safety nets that used to be in place, things like guaranteed affordable housing, free medical services and education, and state-sponsored retirement, are no longer widely available. To hedge against future healthcare, education, and retirement needs that were once covered by the state, personal savings in China now average more than 40% of income. This prudence on the part of Chinese, however, means that they are, on average, consuming far less than per capita incomes would seemingly enable. And thus, in order to rebalance China's economy and put it on a more sustainable footing, Beijing must further strengthen China's pension and healthcare system to boost consumer confidence. As noted above, some progress in this has been made under the harmonious society policy of the past decade, but the transformation is still far from complete. 70% of U.S. GDP comes from consumption. In China, it's only 35%. Further economic rebalancing will probably require additional and more painful shift of resources from all-out expansion of physical capital, where the bulk of China's investment has been for the past several decades, and toward development of human capital, including investments in education, healthcare, affordable housing, and retirement. I describe that as painful because this resource shift will have to be made in the face of certain resistance from the powerful interest groups I mentioned above that are both politically and economically vested in the current pattern of resource allocation. Urbanization is another driver, but also presents challenges, perhaps the most basic being definitional. The Chinese government's definition officially considers anyone with an urban household registration who lives in an area defined as urban for more than 6 months in a given year as qualifying statistically as an urban resident. By that yardstick, China officially became an urban society for the first time in its history last year, and the urban to rural ratio is now 51 to 49. However, only about 35% of Chinese, in fact, have urban household registration. When urban dwellers without household registration have created a several hundred million strong exploitable labor force that has fueled China's boom for the past 30 years. But the urban dwellers without urban registrations are now locked into an underclass facing permanent impoverishment and without hope of upward mobility under the current system. China has found it difficult to fix the household registration problem because entrenched interests resist corrective changes. And here's why. For municipal governments, the current situation is all upside. The governments benefit from more laborers without having to pay for the extra costs of health care, education, and so forth. While statistically urban, city residents without urban household registrations are effectively blocked from enjoying middle-class incomes and benefits and will not be a significant factor during driving China's economy upward as long as this situation obtains. Well, the transition to a new leadership lineup that began last November and concluded with the National People's Congress this month marks only the second time that such power transfer has occurred in China's history, the first, of course, being 10 years ago in 2002. But the new leadership lineup headed by Party Secretary and now President Xi Jinping is facing a very difficult task ahead of it, starting, I think, with tackling reforms that I believe China needed to undertake with the last leadership change a decade ago. These included encouragement of the spread of civil society, the unfettering of the judicial system and the media, and far greater government and party accountability and transparency. Although some analysts are inclined toward the view that China is reaching a tipping point, and I've seen this expressed in quite a few times, I think the new leadership I don't see this happening. I don't think that China is is on the verge of either an economic implosion or a societal explosion. What I am concerned about is that if reforms are not effectively implemented and these challenges effectively addressed, China may be finding itself at some point in the not-distant future facing extreme blockage of its efforts to develop its economy and its society further. It's not so much, again, the idea of an explosion as much as it is economic mediocrity and societal malaise. In effect, the gradual erosion of hope that Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening policy ignited 34 years ago. I believe that China's new leadership now has a once-in-a-decade opportunity to step up to the challenges China faces and address them effectively. I am encouraged by early signs that they are indeed intent on doing this and to reset China on a better path to its future. Thank you. And I hope I've left time for questions. Bill Franklin, please.
Take the easy question first.
Clear the decks.
I first met Joe in the Shanghai Consul General's office more than 20 years ago. This elegant old building looked like out of the movies. And then I walked in, and here's this guy sitting there who looks like he's out of the movies. It looks just like a Consul General ought to look. But your friend, Admiral, said ask him a hard question. So I will try. Some people think the Korean Peninsula is more dangerous than the Middle East in the next 10 years. What could the Chinese be doing to calm that down that they're not doing?
That's not only a hard question, that's a complicated one. First of all, I know the Chinese are no happier about North Korea's adventurism than the United States is. And indeed, they should not be happy about it because this is all taking place in China's backyard. And every time China launches another intercontinental ballistic missile or tests another nuclear device, they're theoretically bringing themselves one step closer to a situation that might even someday include a nuclear exchange. And that certainly would not be in China's interests. But barring the cataclysmic, it's still a drain on China's diplomatic and other resources to be stuck with this unruly next-door neighbor. The thing that I think stops China from really, and they've done this once or twice. I mean, they really leaned on North Korea. I believe the last time was the framework before the framework agreement was finally signed between North Korea and the United States by closing their oil pipeline to North Korea for technical issues for a few days, and Pyongyang got the message. But they're also very worried that that further deterioration of the situation in the Korean Peninsula, and specifically in North Korea itself, could lead to a political implosion that one would drive untold hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of North Koreans across the Chinese border as refugees, and two, might create a political vacuum into which South Korea, along with the United States, would step, bringing the United States once again right up to the Yalu River. And that's certainly not something that China would be happy about. So I think as much as we are, I think China's kind of stuck with a problem right now that they don't have any easy answers to.
Hello.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you for your comments. You were talking about the demographics and the aging population, but there's another demographic phenomenon brought on by the one-child policy and the preference for boys, and that is an awful lot of males versus females in the population, and that is actually emerging even faster than, or as fast as the aging population. Could you speak to that?
Sure. Statistics are always, coming out of China, are always to be viewed with skepticism, but I think the official gender ratio is 120 males to 100 females, which is pretty lopsided. I mean, most countries it's a variance, if at all, of within 1 or 2 percentage points. There's just all kinds of unhappy possibilities that can result from a gender imbalance that great, particularly when it's the number of males versus a surfeit of males over females. Possible increase in crime, more aggressive behavior generally as a nation, and, well, you can use your imagination, but there are a lot of other things that can happen as well. The Chinese government, not so much out of humanitarian concern as much as the realization that this imbalance was likely to lead to severe societal problems, started coming down very hard on gender selection. In theory, you cannot have an ultrasound anymore to determine the gender of the baby, and abortions that were routinely granted in the past because of the gender selection variable are now outlawed. In practice, it's hard to say how widespread or effective these new laws and regulations are being followed, but I think it's a step in the right direction.
You mentioned that the volume of higher education graduates from Chinese universities and institutions of higher education, what I understand is a very stressful competitive environment. Isn't that also accompanied by a high level of unemployment among those graduates, and what is China trying to do about that?
Well, when I talked about rebalancing China's economy, I was speaking mainly about shifting away from fixed asset investment and reliance on trade, particularly exports, and more on developing the domestic market and consumerism in China. But there's another element to this that I didn't talk about, and that is shifting employment opportunities and research and development and actual production to increasingly more upmarket, more technology-driven products and services than has historically been the case over the past quarter century or so. And China, when they first enunciated this policy, seemed like they were going to go in a quite draconian direction, trying to force foreign companies operating in China or selling to China, particularly under government procurement contracts, to make available proprietary technology as part of the deal. And the United States government effectively thwarted China from making this a condition about 2 or 3 years ago. But I think it shows that it shows that in trying to complete this transformation that China is facing some pretty stiff challenges there as well. I'm not altogether clear if China's pedagogical system, part of it deriving from centuries of practice and some of it more recent, you still have to take mandatory courses in Marxist-Leninist Mao Zedong thought, how much that is really going to inspire creativity and the creation of new products and services and new employment opportunities for China's increasingly educated population. On the other hand, I'm also mindful in a country of 1.3 billion people, everything is to scale. And even with a highly competitive but not extremely creative system of educating its students, you're nevertheless going to find at some point a large number of people that are just naturally creative and will find ways to follow their creative instincts. And I think that China eventually will become not just a copier of high technology, but a creator of high technology as well.
Thanks for addressing us today. It's been a while since the conflict with the U.S. surveillance plane and the China military. Are we encroaching less, or are they tolerating more?
I think Admiral Center might have a few things to say about that.
Good military to military relations.
Yeah, that's a good point. We had virtually no mill-to-mill institutionalized contact with China 12 years ago when that incident occurred. And it's been following kind of a rocky course because it doesn't take much of a political dispute between the two governments to derail, at least temporarily, military-to-military conversations. But in fact, they are going on, and part of the purpose of that is to work out rules of the road that both sides can follow to minimize the possibility of future occurrences like that. And they're either working or just really lucky.
Hi, thank you, Joe. Here.
Oh, Asunta.
Okay. What are the things you think that our U.S. ambassador to China, Gary Locke, has done well, and what are the things you think he can improve?
You mean my good friend and former governor, Ambassador Gary Locke? Well, I'll tell you one thing. One of the things he's most proud of, and while it sounds sort of picayune, it's not if you've been involved in it, is he's masterminded, and he gotten the State Department, Security, and others behind him on it, the process of getting a visa, a U.S. visa, if you're in China. When Gary went to Beijing a couple of years ago as ambassador, it was still fairly routine to have to wait weeks from the time you applied until you got a visa interview, and the approval rate was barely 60%. So you waited a long time. You had to pay money to go to Beijing or one of the towns that has a consulate general, stand in line for a long time, get interviewed, and then be refused. Not all visas are granted today either, but a lot more of them are. And instead of waiting weeks, the wait now is down to 2 days. So, and I think that apart from, I think, improving the impression that Chinese have of the United States as a country and the U.S. government as an institution, from a rather abysmal point just a few years ago, there are also practical implications to this as well. That means that students that are coming to the University of Washington or Seattle University are getting here on time. They're not starting their classes 2 or 3 weeks late because they had to wait for a visa. It means that business deals that many of you may be involved in can be consummated far more expeditiously and quickly because the people with whom you're doing business in China can now get here and get here in a timely fashion. So it's not a small matter when you add up all the benefits of just that one significant policy change that Gary was able to effect. And there are limits apart from, there are 2 things that basically an ambassador does. One, he or she is responsible for the administration of the diplomatic mission in the country to which he is accredited, or she. And 2, he or she is charged with responsibility for carrying out the policy of the United States toward that particular country, and in a much more limited way for expressing reasoned opinions about that policy based on experience, based on conversations, based on the appreciation of life and politics in the country of accreditation. And beyond that, there isn't a lot that an ambassador can do. The ambassador doesn't write U.S. policy, and it's pretty much is going to be graded on how well he or she administers the diplomatic mission, including all the consulates general in China, and how well and how effectively, in this case Gary, was in carrying out the policies toward China that were decided in Washington, D.C.
Time for one quick question, Nancy. One quick one, please.
I'll try to make this quick. It's very simple here. Could you comment on President Xi, is that how you pronounce it?
Xi.
Is he and his outlook for relations with the United States going forward? He was commented in the Wall Street Journal as saying last week, to achieve the great revival of the Chinese nation, we must ensure there's a unity between a prosperous country and a strong military. And analysts say Chinese military strategists see China becoming the dominant power in Asia by mid-century. They recognize they can't confront the U.S. military until they overtake it in terms of development and technology. They aspire, and this is the part that interests me, to displace the U.S. as the leading power in Asia. The 21st century will be a contest for supremacy in the Pacific. Do you have a short answer?
No. No, I don't. I'm not. At best, that's aspirational, or worse, depending on how you look at it. It may reflect more the editorial viewpoint of the person that wrote that article than the combined, reasoned, well-thought-out, articulated, and inscribed policy of China by its top leaders. I don't think, while they may aspire to this at some level, just the few challenges that I tried to illustrate in my comments argues that there's no clear and easy path for China going forward in any sense, whether it's overall economic development, improving living standards, or militarizing. Yes, they have a strong military. It will certainly get stronger. But among other things, the writer of that article made a static assumption that all the development and all the improvements in military and warfighting capability would be happening in China and not also in the United States.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe.
Seattle Rotary Online is made possible in part by a grant from First Choice Health, working with the Washington Health Information Collaborative to use technology to bring better health care to patients throughout the Pacific Northwest. First Choice Health.